Hello. Hey guys, my name is Meng and I'm a designer. I code as well, and I wrote a book called Design+Code. So my passion is really to marry design and code together, and I do so for the world of iOS design because I feel like iOS is really taking over the world. I mean, not just iOS but also Android and mobile. Well, everyone has a mobile phone now. Everyone's, starting to make even their website to be adaptive to the mobile phone. And for a lot of people, the mobile phone is their primary device, and some of them is their only computer. The phone is getting bigger with the iPhone 6 Plus, for example. So that's definitely a sign that we should take this a whole lot more seriously. And I would like to say that this is an incredible time to be making apps. As many would call it, this is the year of the prototyping. And there's a lot of prototyping tools coming out. But let's look back a little bit and ask ourselves, why do we prototype? Why do we feel passionate about prototyping nowadays? And why are there so many tools coming out today? Well, I think that it's important to consider that it costs a lot less to build a prototype today, thanks to these simpler tools. So, with iOS 8, suddenly the UI is not so much focused on the Chrome, and suddenly we don't have these intricate textures and these intricate lighting effects or 3D renders. So us designers, we have a lot more time to spend on design. And if your designer is telling you that otherwise, well, he may be lying. He may be doing a little bit too much of Twitter. So skeuomorphic design, took so much time, right? And we don't have to do that anymore. Photoshop, for example, which used to be, the main tool for UI designer, and has such a complex application, like a lot of tools and a lot of options. It took us many, many years to master this tool, and much less for someone who's starting into design. This would be a daunting task to learn, right? So this is not, for me, the main tool for UI design anymore. Today, I use Sketch. Sketch is a tool that is completely vector-based, that is made for UI design, made by a small team, and it is extremely easy to use. It is made for the designer today. It is made for multiple screens. So if you design multiple screens for your app, if you have a phone and you want to preview it, you can literally just click one button on the mirror button, and you can see in real time the results of your design, and you can literally see and how it feels. So that is incredibly important. And moreover, if you want to export that to your app, you have this amazing export tool which allows you to export for multiple resolutions. So for the upcoming 3X, this is going to be a breeze. I like to call Sketch the Mac of design tools. And I'll tell you why. Because all of these tools, all of these options, they don't need to be downloaded. They all come preloaded with the application. And that makes our job as designer, and even developers who wish to learn design, incredibly easy. So, more reasons to prototype. We want better animations, right? iOS 7 and 8 came with a much more transitional animation. We have a lot of spring effects nowadays. So there's a lot of new concepts, and iOS 8 is definitely pushing the envelope. It's really pushing us, it's really inspiring us to make better products, to make more delightful interactions. So in order to make that happen, we need a way to quickly prototype them. We can't just, design a static screen and just hope for the developer to say, well, I'm going to translate everything you did, and I'm going to try to make it via my code. I think that's a very inefficient way to do animations, because developers are not, they're not trained to build animations. At least it takes quite a bit of time for them to get used to that concept. So collaboration is needed, right? And documentations are being replaced. Any sensible startup would consider that, well, instead of building or writing hundreds of pages of documentation and then getting feedback on the text and the documents, which are not real products, why not build a prototype instead? Then the feedback that you get basically is real to whatever you're building. So it's going to feed and it's going to inform how you should design and code your application. So I think that documentations are definitely being replaced by prototypes. It offers a better conversation about the product. It offers a better collaboration between designers and coders. And ultimately, we want better products. We don't want baby products. We don't want something that walks halfway, or we don't want something that is completely static or confusing. We don't want something that is made for us. We want something that is made for the people that we design for, right? We can't ask a marketeer or a product manager how to design products or how the product should be used. We should ask the user, and we should hand the user, the final product, or at least something that seems like a final product, and ask them for feedback. And ultimately, we're going to get better products by doing so. And it's not a surprise to me that there's a lot of new prototyping tools coming out. And a lot of them are really quick. So Flinto, Marvel, Envision, you might be familiar with them. These prototyping tools would allow you to really quickly mock up, a prototype that is previewable on your phone in about 15 minutes. So that's really not a lot of cost when you're building such a quick prototype, right? And then there's Pixate. Now, Pixate is more focused on the animations and directions. You would have one single screen, and then if you want to see how a drag feels, or a fade-in animation feels, or a transform animation, how it looks like, you would mock it up on Pixate. It's really, really quick. You should give it a try. And then there's Framer. Framer is more for coders. So if you're very familiar with JavaScript, or more specific CoffeeScript, you can literally, build a prototype with a real a live example on the right side, and it's really easy to use. For those who are very familiar with code. So let's start with Flinto. Flinto, all you need to do is basically take a bunch of screens, just drag and drop, and then set the segue or the transitions, however you may call it. And then you can share to someone via email. They receive it, and then they would open the email. They would install it as a web app. Now, the web app, would mimic all the interactions that you can see on a native app. And it was so beautiful design that it feels like a real app. And that is the goal, right, for a prototype. The goal of a prototype is to make it seem like this would be the real thing, but not necessarily coding the real data and the real, the final interactions and so on and so forth. Those things that would cost weeks and weeks in development time. So let's take a look at Pixate. Pixate is, again, very focused on one single screen. You have one canvas, and then you would literally take this little dialogue and have one single image. You would drag that to your canvas, and then you would set the interaction if it's a tap, if it's a drag, if it's a double tap, and then you add the animation, and then you would set the properties of those animations. So this, once you're done, you're able to preview it via the app of Pixate on your phone, and you can see how the animation feels. So that is really, really important to start a conversation with the engineer in regards to animations and interactions. And then we have Framer. So Framer uses CoffeeScript, which if you're familiar with Swift is very similar as well. And Framer is completely code-based. You would set the images, set the animation properties, and you can see the live example on the right side. It's really intuitive, and you can also preview it on your device. So all of these new prototyping tools, especially the powerful ones, are definitely figuring out how to show your app on the device, which is crucial. But for me, as a designer slash coder, or at least as someone who comes from a CSS, HTML, and JavaScript background, I've been building apps, web apps at least, for about 14 years. I love to build the real thing, or at least I love the idea that I can eventually build a real thing. And so I'm incredibly passionate about using Xcode. And I would say that, and I hope that more and more designers are getting into this amazing, into this amazing tool to start really, tinkering with all the different techniques that you can do with this tool. I like to call it the CSS of iOS. And I would say that it's even better because it is using a GUI, allowing you to drag and drop, element by element labels, images, UI views, and I can just set the pixel perfection. I can set the auto layout. I can set the buttons and the interactions, and I would make it available to developers, the IB outlets and the IB actions. And for me, it is something that I'm passionate about, and it is something that I would love to do and spend, hours and hours doing it. Or if I just want a quick prototype, I would just drag and drop full screens, or like Pixate per element, like the dialogue and the background separated, or like the full screen, as I said, and just set up the segue very easily and just preview it on my phone. Now with Test Flight, I could literally just spread and give it to my colleagues or to people who would like to test the concept. Because at the end of the day, you want to validate your idea as quickly as possible. And you cannot spend weeks and weeks of development writing code yet. So, you want to do the prototype, and then with those skills that you learn building that prototype, you might want to eventually grow into someone who would own the UI aspect of development. Just the same way that we designers own the CSS and the JavaScript animations, on Xcode, we would own the image catalog, we would own the storyboard aspect, and all the images related to them, and the styling, as well as the auto layout eventually. And then I decided to learn Swift, because I think Swift is a language that is friendly enough for someone who comes from the web, or someone who's never done coding, to learn a language that is much, much simpler. So I think it's important to understand that designers can code. I know that it's hard to wrap around this, but we designers have coded for a long, long time before iOS. We did a lot of CSS, a lot of HTML, a lot of JavaScript. And we can code as long as it is focused on the UI, as long as it is something that we are passionate about. And I believe, especially from my experience, because I've done a bunch of workshops with designers, Swift workshops for designers, who have very little experience in code even, and they were able to follow the language that is Swift. So that is definitely good news for iOS development in general, because I like to believe that developers can design as well. You know, a lot of developers come to me and they're like, I want to learn design. I want to understand design better so I can help designers better, or at least help the product better, make better products. And it is not impossible. You know, again, I'm also doing a bunch of workshops for people who wish to learn design. A lot of people have never done design in the past, and they were able to do really, really powerful, you know, but simple, you know, for someone who's starting, you know, building a design, designing something that would look usable, focusing, as iOS 7 and iOS 8 promotes, focusing on the content, the typography, the colors, the animations, the icons. All of these facets you guys are already extremely familiar with. Now, the question is, how do you marry what you're familiar with something that would make sense to the user? That is the ultimate question. And that's how developers would be able to learn design. And at the end of the day, I like to think that all of this would allow us, designers and coders, to collaborate better and make better products and have better conversations, better teamwork, so that we can ship faster than anyone, more efficient than anyone. We wouldn't have to spend weeks developing something that some people may not even want. You know, we have to validate our idea as quickly as possible. And I think that is extremely important to understand. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for coming to this talk. If you have any question about prototyping or about design, feel free to ask. Any question? Do you guys use any prototyping tool? You don't really prototype?
What about the prototype? You know, prototype, paper.
I'm sorry?
You can prototype with paper and pen.
Oh,
do a snapshot and what do you think about this kind of prototyping? Is it useful or not?
I think it's very useful, but I think prototyping using a pen and paper is very different from prototyping something hyper-realistic. Because the pen and paper, you would ask very specific questions about the concept, and from a very high-level perspective, you know, the idea itself. But as we all know, I mean, idea is far from the execution, right? Like, you would have hundreds of people coming to you, like, I have this amazing app idea, and you would be like, do you have an app or something? Well, that's the question that you should ask yourself. Like, do you have something that I can use? And I think that's what you know, I wish people would get into more, is just get into the execution of building an app. Thank you. Yeah.
Question about Origami.
Yeah.
Facebook. Useful.
Well, Origami is a tool that was invented about 10 years ago, I think, and it was taken from a purpose that was not supposed to be for prototyping into prototyping, because, you know, people didn't have better tools back in the day. And it worked because at Facebook and Apple, they have a bunch of people able to teach how to use Origami. And now, if you have these amazing resources at your company, then I believe that it makes sense to use the tools that your company is able to teach. Now, for a lot of people like me, I don't have access to all of these resources. And Origami is extremely hard to use. For someone who's never done this type of interactions, dragging a bunch of little circle and to these little it's just counterintuitive to the way that I, as a designer, and most people who design products are used to. And I think that's the fundamental problem of Origami. Of course, added to the fact that you can't even preview that on your device. So that's just it's just even worse. But a lot of people make it work. If they have the experience, if they have help, then sure, you can make it work.
Sorry, we have many experience with Photoshop and the new extension that came in the last 2 years for iOS for mobile development, like for example, preview on device directly from Photoshop.
So, like I said, like I mentioned earlier, if you want like a design tool that has all of these options ready for you, you use Sketch. But if you're willing to spend the extra hours, I mean hundreds of extra hours, right, learning a tool like Photoshop, yes, there are tools like Scala View, for example. You can preview. It's a third-party tool. You can also use Slicey, which allows you to export assets. They also came up with Generate, and then there's a bunch of plugins that you can download for Photoshop that makes it easier for you to export assets and such. But in terms of previewing, I think Scala is definitely the best out there right now. But how many of you still use Photoshop, or at least have learned Photoshop? Okay. How many of you use Sketch now? Okay, it's getting there. All I can say is that it is very much increasing, that people are learning Sketch, especially in the design community, and therefore I think developers are more open-minded about it as well, because first of all, the tool is super easy to learn, right? It's not, I'm not asking you to learn Photoshop, because if I'm asking you to learn Photoshop, you're gonna give me the weird eye. But if I'm asking you to learn Sketch, and it's like super focused on UI design and exporting assets and using vectors, then you might say yes. So have you guys used Pixate? Never heard of Pixate? It's really good.
But it is also like extension for Photoshop.
Pixate?
Yes, there is an extension that gives the same functionality for Photoshop.
Okay. I haven't heard. Do you have the name for that?
Yes, I have on sheet.
Okay. So how many of you work with designers? A lot.
Hello.
And how's your experience so far working with designers?
The experience is that many designers don't have any know of the capability of coding, animation, transaction. Experience with Xcode is really important for a designer to understand what can be done with code, the effort to done this animation, this transaction that give us the help to develop an app.
Right. So a lot of designers would come at you, they would be like, hey, I want you to do this animation, it has to move from this to here, it has to move at this speed. And then it's very high level, the way they explain the interactions, right? And you have to translate that into a very technical level to the final product. And that makes the conversation really hard. But more importantly, it requires endless meetings, which requires endless hours and endless amount of money to cover these costs. So, how many of you would love for your designer to learn a little bit of code?
Everybody.
Yeah? So I mean that's my goal essentially. I'm really passionate because as someone who's doing quite a bit of coding daily actually, because even though I'm writing a book, it's still a very interactive book. It's a website, and it's an interactive website. I do all the coding myself, and I make it adaptive for mobile. and I use parse as a backend, and I also write. So I write about building an app. So I have to build the app too, to make sure that people understand the making of an app. So I do quite a bit of coding myself, and that's my passion. My passion is really to teach people, to teach designers who are used to think on a high-level perspective, to think more on a technical perspective, so that they can understand developers better. And so vice versa, how many developers wish to learn more design? Or at least, how many of you think that your designers would want you to learn more design? Yeah? Like, how many times your designers were like, hey, I want you to open Sketch and just do the assets yourself? Or Photoshop? That happens, right? So yeah, that's the point. If you teach them how to, just to set up GitHub, to set up the commit, set it up on their computer just one time, and then just show them around Xcode, and then show them assets catalog, how they can just drag and drop the images to replace it, then you don't even have to go to Sketch or Photoshop to export the assets yourself, because they would export them perfectly. I mean perfectly, because they design it, they should know. So, and then they would just take those assets, they would drag and drop to your project, and they would commit that. And if they make mistakes, which happens, then it's just a commit. It's not something that would be like super problematic, right? So, any other frustrations about designers?
For example, I start to use Xcode. When I present Xcode to my designer, they are happy to send me the PSD, and I don't have the problem with iPhone 6 Plus to cut the single part, single icon, send me the cheaper version, because I take the PSD, the code, take the single part, transform it in Objective-C code, put on Storyboard. So graphics is happy because they develop the PSD.
Right. Yeah, so that's a huge problem, especially in more traditional companies where designers really don't want to take part in the technical aspect of design. They would just ship you a PSD. Like, what the fuck? No, seriously. What do you want me to do with a PSD? I'm just going to go into your layers and just look at how you made this and what is the dimensions and all that stuff? No, I mean, it's just not efficient. You have to tell them, well, give me something that is more technical, something that I can look at or even feel or even see, something that is much closer to what I'm building. I think it's important to start that conversation. Don't be afraid, because essentially that will make them better designers. And that's better for your product and for your company to succeed. Because if a company can make a product that makes people want to use, or that can be shippable in a minimal amount of time, let's say a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months, definitely not a year, because you're gonna miss on a lot of trains. But yeah, it's gonna make your product better, and that's the goal. So, how many of you are frustrated with auto layouts? Please tell me, right? I talk to so many developers, especially iOS developers, and they're just really frustrated with auto layout. I mean, they just don't understand it, or at least they have a hard time to understand, like, kind of the spatial sense of building, these constraints and these, like, positioning and all that stuff. But we designers, we do that, 8 hours a day. We love this, we love positioning stuff. That's what we do. We make shapes that work. So, I think it would make sense that eventually designers would learn auto layout, so that they can come in. They're like, hey, I want to make this, layout adaptive. I want to make it so that if the content is bigger, then the layout would fit into the content. If the title is bigger, then either it has ellipses or it jumps to the second line. That's a hot topic that you always have to ask your designer, hey, how does this look like when you have like a shit ton of text, right? Well, that's a good question. And typically, if they can answer that, then that's great. If they can even do it, then that's even better. So I like to look at the future. I like to look at how we can be more efficient in the future and how we can collaborate better in order to build better products. So what about size classes? I'm sorry. Yeah. What's
Do you consider that many developers create interface by coding, but with the introduction of storyboard transaction, it is for me, for example, a bit harder to translate from coding, animation, coding, also customization of buttons to the storyboard that is more likely for the adaptive interface for designer to see the final product, but it's hard to introduce a custom button or a custom animation with the storyboard. Apple will just iOS 8 have introduction the rendering of custom buttons on storyboard, but this don't give the same interaction, the same layout.
So storyboard historically has been limited before, especially, but I think that storyboard is really improving over the years. And I have talked to a lot of iOS developers. I know you guys hate storyboards, you know, but what I would like to say is that your concept of hating storyboards is based on something that was created a while ago. Now it has improved a lot. But more importantly, I think it is important to say that you may not necessarily want to use storyboards, but you would definitely want a designer to learn storyboard, so that, you know, if you're creating a very, very small project or a very, very small prototype, then they can kind of like use their time wisely. And instead of saying, hey, I'm finished with my design, I want you to look at my PSD, they would be like, hey, how can I help? And then it would be like, well, you know, this can take quite a bit of time. I want you to show you how to use storyboards. You know, I'm not going to do it, but you're going to do it. So it's just a prototype. It's just to experiment with your ideas and make it more technical. So that's the idea of introducing storyboard, I would say. You don't necessarily have to do it, but you would definitely want to collaborate better.
Speaking of auto layout and size classes, I mean, the ideal situation would be, you know, working with a designer like you and just letting you use storyboard and interface builder in general. But as an alternative, what do you suggest to communicate better with designers when we have to, you know a description of the layout in terms of size classes and auto layout?
I think the best conversation that you have with the designer is to show them how it would look like on the real and final device. Show them, hey, this is definitely not working. You know, look. So if maybe that means that you have to do your prototype yourself without even going into the coding yet. But it's just to show them, not abstractly, because I think, you know, we all have this problem of communicating very abstractly about things. You know, you have your own language and they have their own language. And if everyone speaks abstractly about their craft, then nobody is going to understand each other. And that is a huge problem. So the best way to communicate with a designer, I would say, is to try to understand their language and for them to understand your language. And then to show them very, you know, concretely how it looks like and what the problems are. Like, why is this text not fitting? And if it means just mocking up something in a mock-up, more and more prototyping tools are allowing you to do these adaptive layouts. I think Pixate allows you to do that very quickly. But yeah, you can definitely like show them how it's gonna like break their design. Any other question?
You talked about all these tools tools that are around. I would like to know how your workflow looks like when prototyping, and what are the limitations of using a tool like Xcode, interface builder in particular, when prototyping animations.
So I don't consider myself the majority of designer. I consider myself, I think, what I hope to be the majority of designers in the future. So designers who can code, or at least who can build products, right? So to answer your question, the limitation, each of these tools have very specific limitations. This one, for example, is very screen by screen. You cannot make like a drag animation. You cannot make any flip animation or double tap animation. Whatever it is that you can literally push forward the UI of your app. It's very, very hard. This is more like an overall flow, like a bird's eye view of every single screen of your app very quickly. So very real limitations. This one, the real limitation is that you cannot see the whole flow of the app. You can only prototype screen by screen. Like if you want to do a custom transition to the second screen, it would be very, very hard. I'm not even sure if it's possible. You know how in iOS 7 and 8, you have these transitional animations where an app zooms in and you can see that it's really seamless. I think that's more and more kind of present in new apps, and more startups, especially in Silicon Valley. I used to work for a year in Silicon Valley, and more and more of these apps coming out of there are using what iOS 8 recommends, which is a transitional animation. This is an animation that allows the user to not be lost from point A or from one screen to another, right? And it's much less confusing because they have a sense of context. So this one would be more focused on just like a single interaction, and that is a pretty hard limitation. But you know, it works if your need fits the bill. This one too is the same limitation. It is focused on one single interaction, even though I've seen user onboarding and I've seen more animation being made using this that are really powerful. So I think this you can push even further because it uses code, and because it uses code, typically you're not as much limited by the GUI, right? Now, speaking about Xcode, storyboards in particular, storyboards can animate, obviously. So storyboard allows you to set a bunch of segue, so that's the only animation that you do, which is fine. And then it allows you to set and implement each of these elements, buttons, and so on and so forth, but it also allows you to set as like a single image if you want to. So it can be super simple, it can also be super complex or super real. Now, I think that it's important to understand that with storyboard you don't have these limitations of saying, well, is it only specific to one screen or is it specific to multiple screens? Because storyboard can do both if you want to, at least if you connect it to a class. Right? We're talking about Xcode in general. So if a designer masters storyboards, eventually he might say, well, actually I really want to learn the auto layout. Or actually, if I can help, then I want to learn how to code very simple animations in a few lines of code. Maybe eventually they would say, well, if I push this button, I want to change this text to something else. Eventually they might want to say, well, I want to, write a bunch of fake data, and I want to populate it to the UI dynamically, without making like these intricate and complicated connections to a database, or without these, super complicated UI controller, UI collection view or UI table view, which are way more advanced. But see, this is something that I actually eventually learned, and I just started iOS development thanks to an iOS developer in Hong Kong, I started doing that about a year ago. And I learned UI collection view, I learned UI table view, I learned all of these kind of, you know, AF networking and CocoaPods and all that stuff. So yes, I was able to eventually learn something far more complex than what Storyboards offered at the basic. So my point is, even though you're learning something like Storyboard, which may be limiting to some degree, eventually it's going to lead up to a far greater skill. And I think that's really important to understand. I think that's the end of the talk. Anyone? Well, do you have any other questions? Okay. So we have 5 minutes. How many designers are here? So just one designer? So yeah, you know, like you can ask her question too, you know. Now, yeah.
Because designer prefer to use Photoshop instead of Sketch. Because there you go, I told them about Sketch. But it's possible for them to prepare the interface with Photoshop because they are confident. Then use the element in Sketch to prototype. And make this thing for you, or is it overloaded?
If your designer is really familiar with Photoshop, I think there's still a lot of designers who are still very comfortable with Photoshop. I think it's not going to happen overnight, obviously. You can't just say, hey, you know, try Sketch, and then expect that the same day you're going to be, hey, I'm going to build something right now. You know, it's usually doesn't happen that way. In fact, you know, a lot of testimonials about Sketch, they were like, you know, I told my team, and then at the beginning they were like, you know, so bullish about Photoshop, and eventually they got so passionate about Sketch that they started writing blog posts about Sketch, you know, and then they started telling all their friends. So that's the point. It's just that, yes, I don't think it's your job to say, hey, I want to convert this to a Sketch design. I really don't think that's your job. You should definitely more focus your attention more on like maybe showing them a little bit about storyboards. I think that's more your area. Because if you start using Sketch and then you know, like deliver the Sketch document to your CEO instead of the designer would be like, you know.
The meeting with this idea. The idea of this meeting in our company, my company, is to merge the work to improve the development of applications. So the X team is open to learn some new framework. For example, they spent 1 day with us, with the developer. For the first time they see Storyboard. It's strange for them to understand. So finally they understand our problem with graphics.
Right.
Understand that when we say them no, it's impossible to do them, they understand why we tell graphics is impossible. With Storyboard now they understand our problem, developer problem. So we hope in the future to start to modify all the part of the development of the application to speak together during the prototyping. Okay, I think that in the first 1 or 2 months they continue to use Photoshop. But if they told me, okay, I want to make this animation for this element, it's possible. There is some problem with auto layout. The thing that we speak previously, then to start developing is better. It's a first step.
Yes, exactly.
Way, I think.
It is a first step, and to be honest, Xcode is a lot about just learning the UI of Xcode, rather than just necessarily saying, hey, this is about coding or Objective-C or Swift. It's really about learning the UI, and the good news is that the UI of Xcode is not so far from the UI of Sketch. You know, it uses the same, you know, inspectors, and it uses the same kind of toolbar on the left folders and stuff like that. So I think, first of all, there's a way to approach this problem, right? If you approach them, hey, I want you to kind of like learn this really crazy tool. But if you tell them, hey, this is amazing, this is super simple, and you should learn it because it's gonna make your job easier, then they're gonna want to learn it, of course. And if they don't, just come to me and I'll teach them.
I use this approach with plain code, and it works.
Yeah.
First way with the plain code.
Excitement is contagious, right? If you're excited about something, people can learn anything.
Yes.
Okay, thank you guys.